August 1942. Arkhangelsk, Soviet Arctic. The port smelled of diesel fuel and rotting fish, and the metallic tang of ice that never fully melted even in summer, where Captain Ivan Voronov stood on the bridge of the cargo ship Dekabrist and studied charts showing the route that Stavka, the Soviet High Command, had explicitly forbidden as suicidal impossibility, as Arctic passage through waters controlled by German U-boats and aircraft and surface raiders, as navigation nightmare through ice fields that could crush ships like aluminum cans, as supply route that had been attempted twice in spring 1942, and both times had resulted in convoy destruction with losses so catastrophic that Stalin had personally ordered that no further convoys would use the northern route until weather conditions improved and German naval strength diminished, that all Lend-Lease cargo would be routed through Persia or Pacific, despite the delays this imposed on desperately needed war materiel reaching Soviet forces who were fighting for survival at Stalingrad, where German armies were grinding toward the Volga and threatening to split the Soviet Union in half. Voronov was 43 years old, a merchant marine captain who had sailed Arctic waters since 1925, who understood ice navigation with the intimacy that comes from 17 years of experience threading ships through pack ice, who had survived German attacks on previous convoys, and who had seen firsthand the equipment shortages that were crippling Soviet defensive operations, who commanded a Liberty ship carrying 40 Sherman tanks and 200 tons of ammunition and medical supplies that Stalingrad defenders needed immediately, rather than in 3 months, when the Persian route would deliver them after the city had fallen and after the strategic situation had collapsed beyond recovery. Let's pause here for a moment. If you find value in stories like this, you can support the channel by liking the video and subscribing. After watching, leaving a brief comment, even a simple word, helps more than you might expect. Your support keeps these stories alive and visible. Thank you. Let's move on. The cargo represented American industrial capacity translated into weapons that Soviet factories couldn't produce quickly enough, represented tanks with armor and reliability superior to Soviet designs, represented ammunition manufactured to specifications that Soviet wartime production couldn't match because Soviet industry was prioritizing quantity over quality, represented medical supplies, including antibiotics, that Soviet pharmaceutical industry couldn't synthesize in sufficient quantities. The cargo was critical, but Stavka had ordered it sent via the Persian Gulf route, which would require 2 months minimum before the tanks reached Stalingrad. 2 months during which German forces would consolidate their positions, and Soviet defenders would be destroyed by panzer divisions whose armor the Soviet forces currently lacked adequate weapons to counter. The banned Arctic route would take 12 days if navigation was successful. 12 days of exposure to German attacks and ice hazards and Arctic storms. 12 days that were unacceptably risky according to Stavka assessment that weighted the risk of losing ships against the timeline for delivering cargo. 12 days that Voronov believed were acceptable risk, because 2 months via Persia meant the cargo would arrive too late to affect the battle that was deciding the war's outcome, because equipment that arrived after Stalingrad fell was worthless regardless of how safely it was delivered, because sometimes the risky option was actually the prudent option when the alternative was certain strategic failure achieved through excessive caution. The ban on Arctic convoys had been issued in June 1942 after convoy PQ-17 had been scattered by German attacks and had lost 24 of 35 ships, after the losses had convinced both British Admiralty and Soviet Stavka that Arctic route was untenable during summer months when continuous daylight eliminated the concealment that darkness provided, when German aircraft could search for convoys continuously without pause, when U-boats could operate on surface without fear of being caught submerged at dawn. The ban was reasonable by every operational analysis, was justified by casualty rates that made Arctic convoys statistically suicidal, was enforced by Stalin's personal directive that explicitly stated no convoy commander was authorized to use northern route without Stavka approval, and that violating this directive would result in court-martial and execution for insubordination. The PQ-17 disaster had been particularly catastrophic because the convoy had been ordered to scatter when British intelligence incorrectly believed that the German battleship Tirpitz was about to attack, scattered ships being destroyed individually by U-boats and aircraft that picked them off one by one without the defensive coordination that convoy formation provided, scattered crews dying in Arctic waters while watching their ships burn and sink, scattered cargo totaling 430 tanks and 210 aircraft, and 99,316 tons of general cargo going to the bottom, while Stalin watched desperately needed equipment disappear, and while Soviet forces at the front continued fighting with inadequate supplies because the maritime supply route that was supposed to sustain them was proving too vulnerable to German interdiction. The psychological impact of PQ-17's destruction had been severe on both British and Soviet commanders who had to decide whether continuing Arctic convoys was worth the casualties, had to calculate whether delivering 20% of cargo while losing 80% of ships was acceptable exchange rate, or whether alternative routes, despite their delays, were actually more effective because they delivered cargo reliably, even if slowly. The consensus had been that Arctic convoys during summer daylight were unacceptable losses, that the route had to be suspended until autumn darkness returned, that equipment delays were preferable to equipment losses because delayed cargo eventually arrived, while destroyed cargo was permanent loss. But this consensus hadn't accounted for Stalingrad, hadn't anticipated that Soviet defensive operations would reach crisis point in August, when equipment couldn't wait until October, hadn't calculated that strategic timeline could make risky delivery attempts more valuable than safe delivery delays, hadn't considered that individual ship commanders might have tactical intelligence and navigation expertise that would allow them to succeed where convoys had failed because single ships could evade detection more easily than large formations that German reconnaissance could locate and track while organizing concentrated attacks. But Voronov had received intelligence from British liaison officers that German naval strength in Arctic Norway had been temporarily reduced, that the battleship Tirpitz had returned to Germany for repairs, that several U-boat packs had been redeployed to Atlantic, where Allied convoy traffic was heavier, that a window existed where Arctic route might be less defended than the assessments that had led to the ban had assumed. The intelligence was unofficial and unverified, couldn't be used to request authorization, because Stavka policy was that Arctic route was banned regardless of German strength, that the ban was absolute rather than conditional on tactical circumstances, that questioning the ban was questioning Stalin's judgment, which was career-ending insubordination even when Stalin's judgment was demonstrably wrong. Voronov made his decision on August 15, 1942, made it understanding that he was risking his life and his crew's lives and his career, made it believing that delivering 40 Sherman tanks to Stalingrad in 12 days was worth more than delivering them safely in 2 months, made it calculating that even if half the cargo was lost to German attacks, 20 Sherman tanks arriving soon were more valuable than 40 Sherman tanks arriving too late. He informed his crew that they would be taking the forbidden northern route, informed them that this violated direct orders from Stavka, informed them that they could refuse, and he would make no record of their refusal because the insubordination was his responsibility alone, informed them that those who volunteered would be risking execution for following orders that were themselves illegal under Soviet military law. Every crew member volunteered. 38 sailors who understood they were violating orders that could get them executed, but who also understood that Soviet forces at Stalingrad desperately needed the equipment they were carrying, who trusted Voronov's judgment about Arctic navigation more than they trusted Stavka's assessment that northern route was suicidal, who believed that serving the war effort mattered more than following regulations that made no tactical sense, even if those regulations came directly from Stalin. The departure from Arkhangelsk occurred at 0200 hours on August 16th, documented in port records as equipment transfer to Arctic bases, rather than as convoy departure, concealed from authorities who would have stopped the ship if they understood Voronov intended to violate the Arctic convoy ban, executed with complicity from British liaison officers who understood that equipment delays were killing Soviet soldiers, and who chose to ignore Voronov's violation of Soviet regulations, because getting tanks to Stalingrad was more important than enforcing bans that prevented tanks from reaching the troops who needed them. The route Voronov selected was the most dangerous variant of the Arctic Passage, sailed closer to German-occupied Norway than standard convoy routes, threaded through ice fields that forced slow speeds and difficult navigation, accepted increased exposure to German forces in exchange for reducing transit time by 2 days compared to routes that stayed farther north, where ice was heavier and where avoiding ice fields would have added distance and delay that Voronov calculated were unacceptable given Stalingrad's timeline requirements. The first 3 days passed without incident, Dekabrist making good progress through light pack ice, maintaining radio silence to avoid detection by German direction-finding stations, navigating by dead reckoning and celestial sights when rare clear weather permitted, operating with minimal lighting during the brief darkness periods that occurred even during Arctic summer, proceeding with watchfulness that bordered on paranoia because German forces could appear at any moment and because a single attack could destroy the ship and its cargo and vindicate Stavka's ban by demonstrating that Arctic convoys were indeed suicidal during summer months. On August 19th, German reconnaissance aircraft located Dekabrist, shadowed the ship for 2 hours, while presumably reporting position to U-boat commands and air bases, departed without attacking, but having accomplished the mission of marking the target for forces that would execute the actual attack. Voronov understood that German forces would now converge on Dekabrist's position, understood that he had perhaps 12 hours before attacks began, understood that his decision to use the forbidden route had just become test of whether his judgment was correct or whether Stavka had been right to ban Arctic convoys as suicidal operations that wasted ships and cargo without achieving delivery. The first U-boat attack came at 0340 hours on August 20th, 2 torpedoes fired from range that suggested the U-boat commander was confident in his approach, confident that the cargo ship couldn't evade at the slow speeds that ice navigation required, confident that Soviet merchant vessels lacked the damage control capabilities to survive torpedo hits that would flood compartments and doom the ship to sinking before survivors could be rescued in Arctic waters, where exposure killed within minutes. But Voronov had anticipated torpedo attack, had positioned lookouts with specific instructions to watch for periscope wakes, had drilled the crew on emergency maneuvers that were unconventional for cargo ships, but which Voronov believed might create enough uncertainty in the attacking submarine's firing solution to cause torpedoes to miss. When the lookout spotted the torpedo wakes, Voronov ordered hard rudder turn that normally would have been too risky in ice-filled waters, but which was necessary to avoid the torpedoes whose tracks were visible in the phosphorescent water. The maneuver succeeded partially, the first torpedo missing by 10 meters, the second striking glancing blow on the stern that damaged the rudder and propeller, but which failed to detonate the warhead because the impact angle was too shallow to trigger the magnetic pistol that German torpedoes used. Dekabrist survived with damage that reduced speed and maneuverability, but which didn't prevent continued navigation, survived because Voronov's unconventional tactics had worked despite being untested and despite violating standard doctrine for cargo vessels under attack. The U-boat surfaced at 0415 hours to finish Dekabrist with deck gunfire, standard procedure when torpedo attacks failed, and when the submarine commander believed the target was helpless and the submarine was safe from counterattack. But Dekabrist carried defensive armament that most cargo ships lacked, two 45mm anti-aircraft guns that Voronov had insisted on installing, despite regulations that merchant vessels weren't supposed to carry weapons that might make them legitimate military targets under maritime law. The guns engaged the surfaced U-boat at 800 meters range, hit the conning tower with third salvo, forced the U-boat to crash dive with casualties that prevented it from continuing the attack, achieved defensive success that validated Voronov's decision to arm his ship despite regulations forbidding it. The German aircraft attacks began at 1200 hours, 3 Ju-88 bombers approaching from Norwegian bases, attacking with bombs and machine gun fire that targeted the cargo holds where the Sherman tanks were stored, attempting to destroy the cargo rather than sink the ship, because sinking the ship would send the tanks to the bottom, while destroying them aboard would ensure they never reached Soviet forces. Voronov's anti-aircraft guns engaged the bombers, scored hits on one aircraft that forced it to break off, damaged another, drove the formation away after they had dropped their bombs, which mostly missed because the aircraft had to evade defensive fire rather than conducting calm bombing runs. 2 bombs hit Dekabrist, one striking the forecastle and causing casualties among the deck crew, one penetrating the forward hold and destroying 3 Sherman tanks, while damaging 2 others with fragments and fire. The losses were acceptable. 35 operational tanks remaining from the original 40. The cargo still valuable enough to justify continuing despite damage and casualties. The mission still achievable if Dekabrist could reach Murmansk, where the tanks could be offloaded and transported overland to Stalingrad. The navigation became more difficult as ice conditions worsened, as damage to the rudder and propeller made maneuvering through ice fields nearly impossible, as Voronov was forced to choose between reducing speed to manageable levels for the damaged steering or maintaining speed that would complete the transit before German forces could organize more effective attacks. He chose speed over safety, chose to risk ice damage rather than prolonging exposure to enemy action, chose the aggressive option that maximized delivery probability, even though it increased the risk of catastrophic failure if the ice crushed the hull or if the damaged propeller failed completely. The ice navigation required constant attention from the entire bridge crew, required posting lookouts who watched for ice formations that could damage the hull, required engine room personnel who monitored the damaged propeller for signs of complete failure that would leave Dekabrist dead in the water and vulnerable to German forces that would certainly locate and destroy a stationary target, required deck crews who stood ready to fend off ice flows using poles and cables and techniques that Voronov had developed through 17 years of Arctic experience, but which were being tested under combat conditions, where mistakes would be fatal. The crew's morale fluctuated between confidence in Voronov's expertise and terror at the accumulated damage that was making the ship increasingly fragile, fluctuated between pride at having volunteered for forbidden mission and fear that their volunteer status wouldn't protect them from courts-martial if they survived, fluctuated between determination to deliver the cargo and recognition that every hour brought new German attacks that might succeed where previous attacks had failed. The cook maintained hot meals despite battle damage to the galley. The engineers kept the damaged propeller turning despite vibrations that suggested imminent mechanical failure. The gunners remained at their stations despite casualties, and despite knowing that their defensive weapons were marginal deterrent against German forces that could overwhelm them through sustained attack. Voronov maintained command presence by sharing risks with his crew, by standing watch on the exposed bridge during German air attacks when he could have taken shelter, by personally directing ice navigation during critical passages when delegate responsibility would have been safer for him, but less effective for the ship, by demonstrating through his actions that he valued mission success and crew survival more than he valued his own safety or his career prospects that would certainly be damaged regardless of whether the mission succeeded or failed, because Stalin punished success and failure differently, but punished both when they involved insubordination. On August 22nd, the crew discovered that one of the Sherman tanks in the damaged hold had shifted during the August 20th bombing, had broken free from its securing chains, and was moving with the ship's motion in ways that threatened to damage other tanks and to compromise the hull integrity where the bomb had penetrated. Securing the tank required entering the damaged hold where structural damage made collapse possible, required working in darkness because electrical power to that section had been lost, required physical labor that exhausted men who were already fatigued from constant battle stations and inadequate sleep. Chief Engineer Pavel Sokolov volunteered to lead the team that would secure the tank, entered the damaged hold with 3 volunteers, worked for 6 hours in conditions that were dangerous even without combat damage, successfully resecured the tank using improvised chains and bracing, emerged exhausted but having prevented cargo loss that would have reduced the mission's value, and having demonstrated the crew competence that made Voronov's decision to use forbidden route viable rather than suicidal, because competent crews could manage risks that would destroy ships with incompetent crews. By August 24th, Dekabrist had penetrated within 200 miles of Murmansk, had survived 4 more U-boat contacts that Voronov evaded through aggressive maneuvering and route changes that forced the submarines to reposition, had endured 6 more air attacks that were beaten off by anti-aircraft fire and by the increasing proximity to Soviet air bases from which fighters could provide cover. The cargo was intact, minus the 5 tanks lost in the bombing. The crew had suffered 12 casualties, including 4 dead. The ship was damaged but still functional. The mission was on track to succeed despite Stavka ban and despite German efforts to prevent Arctic convoy operations. Soviet coastal defenses detected Dekabrist on August 25th, challenged the ship to identify itself and explain why it was approaching Murmansk from northern route that was supposed to be closed to all traffic, confronted Voronov with the reality that his violation of orders would now be discovered, and that authorities would have to decide whether to treat his success as heroic initiative or as criminal insubordination that warranted court-martial regardless of whether the tanks had been delivered. Voronov transmitted that he was delivering critical Lend-Lease cargo via emergency route, transmitted that he took full responsibility for violating the Arctic convoy ban, transmitted that his crew had followed his orders and should not be punished for his decisions, transmitted request that authorities focus on unloading the Sherman tanks immediately rather than on prosecuting him for insubordination until after the tanks had been delivered to forces that needed them at Stalingrad. The response was silence for 4 hours, while Dekabrist proceeded toward Murmansk under escort from Soviet destroyers that had been dispatched to intercept what authorities initially believed might be German infiltration using captured Soviet vessel. During those 4 hours, reports of Voronov's successful transit were reaching Stavka headquarters, where officers were debating whether Captain Voronov had demonstrated commendable initiative or unacceptable insubordination, whether his success validated risk-taking that violated direct orders, or whether allowing success to excuse insubordination would undermine military discipline that depended on subordinates following orders even when they disagreed with them. The debate was resolved by intervention from the front, from Stalingrad, where commanders learning about 40 Sherman tanks arriving immediately, rather than in 2 months, radioed Stavka requesting that Captain Voronov be decorated rather than court-martialed, that his initiative be recognized as exactly the kind of tactical flexibility that Soviet commanders needed to exercise when central planning created delays that were strategically unacceptable, that punishing success would send message that commanders should prioritize following orders over achieving mission objectives, which would guarantee defeat in war where German forces consistently demonstrated superior tactical initiative. Dekabrist docked in Murmansk on August 26th, offloaded 35 Sherman tanks and remaining ammunition and medical supplies, completed delivery 12 days after departing Arkhangelsk, achieved exactly what Voronov had calculated was possible if the forbidden route was used, demonstrated that Stavka assessment of Arctic convoys as suicidal was overly conservative when German forces were temporarily weakened, validated Voronov's judgment that sometimes violating orders produces better outcomes than following them. The tanks reached Stalingrad on September 3rd, were immediately deployed to counterattack operations that recaptured key positions, were credited by Soviet commanders with stabilizing defensive lines at critical moment when German offensive was approaching breakthrough, were recognized as having arrived at exactly the moment when their tactical impact was maximized, were acknowledged as having been more valuable delivered in 12 days via risky route than they would have been delivered in 60 days via safe route. German intelligence officers analyzing Soviet defensive operations at Stalingrad identified the Sherman tanks and were shocked that Soviet forces had received American armor so quickly, were shocked because German assessments had concluded that Allied supply routes to Soviet Union were so disrupted that significant equipment deliveries were impossible until weather improved, were shocked that cargo they believed would take months to arrive had actually appeared in the battlefield within 2 weeks of leaving port, were forced to revise their understanding of Soviet supply capabilities and to acknowledge that Arctic convoys were still operational despite German efforts to interdict them. One German intelligence report stated, "Soviet forces at Stalingrad have received American M4 Sherman tanks that our assessments indicated wouldn't arrive until October at earliest. The tanks appear to have been delivered via northern convoy route that we believed was closed due to our naval superiority in Arctic waters. Either our assessment of convoy vulnerability was incorrect, or Soviet commanders are accepting catastrophic loss rates to deliver critical equipment. Recommend increased naval operations in Arctic to ensure northern supply route is actually interdicted rather than merely assessed as interdicted." This German shock at discovering Soviet supplies arriving faster than expected represented validation of Voronov's decision, represented confirmation that his violation of orders had achieved strategic surprise that German planning hadn't anticipated, represented success that wouldn't have occurred if he had followed regulations that prioritized procedural compliance over tactical effectiveness. Stalin's response to Voronov's insubordination was characteristically complex, reflecting dictators' tendency to value results over process, while also needing to maintain discipline that prevented subordinates from routinely ignoring orders. Voronov was summoned to Moscow in September 1942, was decorated as Hero of the Soviet Union for delivering critical supplies to Stalingrad, was simultaneously censured for violating direct orders from Stavka, was promoted to Convoy Operations Coordinator with explicit instructions that future Arctic convoys required authorization regardless of tactical circumstances, was told that his initiative had been acceptable this once, but that repeated violations would result in execution because Soviet military discipline couldn't function if every captain decided which orders to follow and which to ignore. The meeting with Stalin was brief and pointed, Stalin stating, "Captain Voronov, you violated my orders. You risked your ship and crew on route that I determined was too dangerous. You delivered tanks that helped save Stalingrad. If you had failed, you would have been shot for insubordination and for wasting equipment that the motherland desperately needs. Because you succeeded, you are hero. Do not test my patience by repeating this insubordination. Are we clear?" Voronov responded, "Yes, Comrade Stalin, we are clear." This exchange, later recounted by witnesses who were present, captured Stalin's pragmatic approach to military discipline that punished failure harshly but rewarded success even when success was achieved through insubordination, that maintained absolute authority while acknowledging that sometimes subordinates understood tactical situations better than central command understood them, that preserved discipline while allowing limited flexibility for officers who demonstrated judgment that produced results. The ceremony where Voronov received the Hero of the Soviet Union decoration was attended by senior Stavka officers who had opposed his Arctic transit, who had advocated for his court-martial before Stalingrad commanders intervened, who now had to publicly celebrate success that had vindicated Voronov's judgment while implicitly criticizing their own assessment that had led to the ban he violated. The awkwardness was palpable as these officers congratulated Voronov for insubordination that had proven correct while knowing that their own caution had been proven excessive, while understanding that Voronov's success made their previous confidence in the Arctic convoy ban seem like failure of imagination rather than prudent risk management. Admiral Nikolai Kuznetsov, People's Commissar of the Navy, spoke at the ceremony with language that carefully balanced praise for Voronov's achievement against warning that his example shouldn't be interpreted as permission for routine violation of orders. Kuznetsov stated, "Captain Voronov demonstrated exceptional courage and navigation skill. His success delivered critical equipment to our forces at Stalingrad. His initiative is to be commended. However, his violation of direct orders cannot become standard practice. Military discipline requires obedience to command authority. Captain Voronov's case is exceptional because his judgment was correct and because strategic necessity justified the risk he took. But exceptional cases do not establish general precedent. Future commanders must seek authorization before undertaking operations that violate standing orders. Unauthorized initiative that fails will be punished severely." This is not contradiction. This is reality of military command, where success and failure are judged differently because the stakes of war require both discipline and flexibility in proper balance. This speech articulated the tension that Voronov's success had created in Soviet military culture, the tension between centralized control that Stalin demanded and tactical flexibility that combat effectiveness required, the tension between punishing disobedience and rewarding initiative, the tension between maintaining discipline and encouraging commanders to exercise judgment that might sometimes require violating orders when orders were based on outdated information or when tactical circumstances diverged from assumptions that had informed the orders. The broader impact of Voronov's successful transit was that Stavka partially lifted the Arctic convoy ban, authorizing limited convoy operations during periods when German naval strength appeared reduced, establishing procedures for requesting emergency authorization to use northern route when cargo urgency justified accepting risks that normal operations would avoid, creating framework that allowed tactical flexibility while maintaining central control over strategic decisions about resource allocation and acceptable risk levels. British naval liaison officers who had supported Voronov's decision to violate Soviet regulations reported to Admiralty that Soviet command structure was more flexible than British assessments had assumed, that Soviet officers were capable of tactical initiative that British doctrine associated with Western military culture rather than with Soviet centralized planning, that the stereotype of Soviet military as rigidly hierarchical and incapable of adaptation was incorrect when circumstances forced Soviet commanders to choose between following orders and winning battles. One British report stated, "Captain Voronov's Arctic convoy transit demonstrates that Soviet officers will violate direct orders when tactical situation requires initiative. His success and subsequent decoration indicate that Soviet command recognizes value of tactical flexibility despite official emphasis on centralized control. This suggests that Soviet military is more adaptable than our previous assessments indicated, and that underestimating Soviet tactical initiative is a mistake that German forces are also making." American observers studying Lend-Lease delivery operations noted that Voronov's transit had demonstrated that Arctic route remained viable despite German attempts to close it, that Soviet willingness to accept risks was higher than American planning had assumed, that equipment delivery timelines could be significantly reduced if Soviet commanders were willing to violate safety protocols that American logistics doctrine would never compromise. The observation raised questions about whether American excessive caution was actually prudent planning or whether it sometimes produced suboptimal outcomes by prioritizing safety over speed when speed had strategic value that safety couldn't provide. The Sherman tanks that Voronov delivered participated in combat operations at Stalingrad through November 1942, were credited with destroying 11 German Panzer III and Panzer IV tanks in defensive engagements, provided mobile firepower that Soviet forces had lacked during early stages of the battle, demonstrated that American armor was tactically effective in Soviet hands, despite German propaganda suggesting that American equipment was inferior to German designs, validated the Lend-Lease program by showing that American production was translating into battlefield results that contributed to Soviet victory. By February 1943, when Soviet forces completed the encirclement and destruction of German Sixth Army at Stalingrad, analysts calculating the factors that had contributed to Soviet success included the timely arrival of American equipment delivered via Arctic convoys that weren't supposed to be operational, included Voronov's initiative as example of how individual decisions could have strategic consequences when those decisions were correct, included recognition that sometimes the banned option was actually the right option when institutional caution was preventing actions that tactical reality required. Voronov continued serving in convoy operations through 1943 and 1944, coordinated Arctic supply routes that delivered millions of tons of Lend-Lease equipment to Soviet forces, developed tactical procedures that reduced convoy losses while maintaining delivery schedules, became expert in Arctic navigation, whose judgment was trusted by both Soviet Stavka and British Admiralty officers who coordinated Allied supply operations. His August 1942 violation of orders became legend within Soviet merchant marine as example of how breaking rules sometimes served the state better than following them. As demonstration that rigid adherence to regulations could be counterproductive when regulations were based on outdated assessments of tactical conditions, as validation that individual initiative had value even in military system that officially demanded absolute obedience to central authority. In post-war interviews, Voronov discussed his decision to use the forbidden Arctic route with language that carefully balanced acknowledgement of the risk against justification for having taken it. He stated, "Stavka banned Arctic convoys because losses were high. The ban was reasonable based on available information. But I had information suggesting German strength was temporarily reduced. I calculated that the risk of using northern route was lower than Stavka assessment indicated. I also calculated that delivering tanks in 12 days was strategically more valuable than delivering them safely in 2 months. I violated orders because following them would have produced worse outcome for the Soviet Union. I would have accepted court-martial if I had been wrong. I was correct, so I was decorated instead." This is how military systems should function. Punish bad judgment that produces failure, reward good judgment that produces success, regardless of whether success required violating regulations. This assessment reflected pragmatic view of military discipline that valued outcomes over procedures, that treated orders as guidance rather than as absolute requirements when tactical circumstances diverged from assumptions that had informed the orders, that accepted insubordination as sometimes necessary evil when subordinates understood situations better than commanders who issued orders based on incomplete information or outdated intelligence. The German forces who attempted to interdict Voronov's August 1942 transit were shocked when they discovered that despite their attacks, the cargo ship had successfully delivered its cargo, were shocked that Soviet commander had violated his own side's regulations to achieve delivery, were shocked that Soviet system had rewarded rather than punished the violation, were shocked that their assumptions about Soviet supply capabilities had been wrong and that Arctic route remained operational despite German efforts to close it. German naval commanders reviewing the operation concluded that Soviet merchant marine was more competent and more aggressive than German assessments had assumed, that Arctic convoy operations couldn't be stopped simply through threat of attack, but required sustained effort to actually sink every ship that attempted the passage. That Soviet willingness to accept losses was higher than German tolerance for casualties, which meant that interdiction campaign required destroying more ships than German forces could actually engage, given the vast Arctic operational area and the limited German naval strength available for Arctic operations. One German after-action analysis stated, Soviet merchant vessel Dekabrist successfully transited Arctic route in August 1942, despite our interdiction efforts. The Soviet captain violated his own orders to use route that Soviet command had banned. His success demonstrates that Soviet logistics is not constrained by central planning when tactical initiative is exercised by competent commanders. We cannot assume that Soviet supply operations will follow predictable patterns or that banned routes will remain closed. Future operations must account for possibility that Soviet commanders will violate their own regulations when they believe tactical advantage justifies the risk. This German recognition that Soviet forces were more flexible than assumed represented strategic surprise, similar to what Voronov had achieved, represented adjustment in German understanding that had to account for enemy capabilities that exceeded what stereotypes about Soviet rigidity had predicted, represented acknowledgement that underestimating enemy initiative was mistake that created vulnerabilities for forces that planned based on assumptions rather than on realistic assessment of what enemies were actually capable of accomplishing. The legacy of Voronov's forbidden Arctic transit extended beyond the immediate tactical success of delivering Sherman tanks, extended to organizational learning about when rules should be followed and when they should be broken, extended to recognition that military systems needed to balance discipline with flexibility if they wanted to achieve optimal results in dynamic tactical environments where conditions changed faster than central commands could update orders, extended to demonstration that sometimes the hero was the officer who disobeyed orders rather than the officer who followed them. The trick that shocked the Germans wasn't technological innovation or tactical surprise in conventional sense, was instead demonstration that Soviet military system was capable of initiative that German planning hadn't anticipated, was proof that Soviet commanders would violate their own regulations when tactical reality required it, was evidence that rigid centralized control that characterized Soviet military doctrine was actually more flexible than it appeared when subordinates demonstrated judgment that produced results. Captain Voronov's decision to use the forbidden route was vindicated by success, but would have resulted in execution if he had failed, was heroic precisely because it was risky, was valuable precisely because it violated orders that were preventing optimal outcomes, was shocking to Germans precisely because it demonstrated Soviet capabilities that German assumptions hadn't accounted for, was memorable precisely because it proved that sometimes the banned option was the right option when institutional caution was preventing necessary action, and when individual judgment was better than collective planning, and when violating Stalin's direct orders was serving the Soviet Union more effectively than obeying them would have served.